When my wife and I bought this house, we didn't really realize just how strange its layout was until we started living in it. It had clearly been built in pieces, added to over the decades by different owners. 2 kitchens, 2 bathrooms, separate power boxes for each floor, and a basement that connected not only the garage but also, oddly, to an old stairwell that had been sealed off with drywall. The realtor said that it used to be a duplex or something, and yeah, that sort of made sense at first, I guess, until it just didn't. You see, for the first few years, we barely touched the downstairs kitchen. It still had 80s appliances, half the drawers were slammed shut, and the light above the sink flickered no matter how many times we replaced that bulb. We ended up just sort of ignoring it though, until our son was born. Late at night, bottles and diaper changes made running up and downstairs pretty much unbearable, so we started sleeping mostly on the upper floor and keeping baby supplies below. That's when the small things began. It was always subtle at first, like coffee mugs left in the sink after we both swore that we'd washed them. The bathroom door downstairs left wide open, though we'd started keeping it shut to stop the cat from scratching the shower curtain. One morning, we found every single light on the ground floor burning bright. We blamed exhaustion, naturally. Anyone with a newborn knows just how reality sort of blurs at 3 in the morning like that. But over the next few months, the pattern grew stranger. Chairs were dragged out into the middle of rooms. Plates appeared in really odd places, sometimes stacked neatly on the stairs, for instance. A single spoon was found inside of the washing machine at one stage. I caught my wife standing in the hallway one night, holding our son, staring down toward the dark stairwell. "I heard someone whisper my name," she said quietly. It had apparently come from below. I laughed it off, but that same week I saw something that made even my stomach turn. I was coming down the stairs before dawn, bleary-eyed, as normal, when I caught sight of a shadow moving just beyond the kitchen door. A quick, darting figure, gone the moment that I switched on the light. We decided to install motion lights downstairs, and they kept going off in the middle of the night all the time. And then came the red scarf. Now, it was folded carefully on the washing machine one morning, a knitted thing, wool with small white flecks in the stitching. Neither of us owned it, and no one that we knew had visited recently, so it was just a complete mystery. That's when we finally checked the basement door, because it was unlocked. The door to the garage, too. We brushed it off as our mistake until one night while feeding our son, I heard the faintest sound below. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, almost careful. I froze, holding my breath. Then there was another sound. A soft cough, like someone trying not to make a noise. By morning, I convinced myself that it had been the pipes or the cats or maybe both. But my wife just wasn't buying it anymore. She begged me to set up cameras, and I eventually caved when a friend offered me her old security system. It wasn't fancy, grainy footage, intermittent disconnects and all that, but it was better than nothing. The first 2 nights, there was nothing too. But the third night, that changed everything. At 12:43 a.m., movement triggered the downstairs kitchen camera. The footage showed 3 people slipping in through the door that led to the basement. A woman, maybe mid-20s, carrying a canvas duffel. A tall man with a shaved head and tattoos down both arms. And another older, broader, moving differently. He kept glancing toward the ceiling. They didn't look panicked. In fact, they looked like they had done this before. The woman went straight to the fridge. The younger man sat in one of our chairs, calm as if it was their own house. The older man, though, he disappeared up the stairs to our floor. The camera in the hallway caught nothing for an hour, And when he finally came back down, he looked satisfied almost. Well, as you can imagine, that was definitely the last straw. We called the police and they came and took the footage and searched the basement, but there was nothing. Not a footprint, not a broken window, just dust and the faint smell of damp concrete. Then the officer called me over. "Do you usually keep this door locked?" he asked, pointing to a narrow crawl space that led behind the foundation. It had a latch that I'd never seen before, and it wasn't locked. Inside, too, was a short tunnel leading to the back of the garage. And so, this meant that we had been living with that open passage the whole time. Anyone could have come and gone. They did find partial prints on the garage door. Unfortunately, though, none of them matched any on the system. The police kept us updated for weeks and then just went quiet. We replaced every lock and sealed the crawl space, bought motion sensors, and even got a dog. And life went back to something sort of normal, I guess. 3 months later, though, one night our son woke us up crying. I went to check on him, and when I passed the window overlooking the driveway, I instantly froze. There was a figure stood by the garage, not moving, not looking at the house, and just sort of standing there, facing the door. I turned away for a split second to grab my phone, and when I looked back, they were gone. I instantly called the police again, but nothing was found. Now, years later, we still live here. The basement is sealed, lights left on all night, and the cameras are definitely newer and sharper and always recording. Sometimes, too, when I review the footage out of habit, I'll see flickers in the corner of the frame, shapes that just don't match our movements, and soft blurs that seem to pause by the stairs as if watching. Obviously, it's nothing really, but still, when I see those things, I would be lying if I didn't say that I didn't panic for a moment. My wife says that I'm just being paranoid, but I've also noticed something about the red scarf that we kept in the storage as evidence. Every few months, I still find it somewhere new, and I swear to you that I never move it. So, I don't know if that means that somebody's still getting in or not, or maybe our place is just haunted. Either way, it's a bit of a disturbing detail, and really, I don't know what to make of it. There's a stretch of the Cascade Range between White Pass and Goat Rocks that feels wrong when the sun dips behind the ridgeline. It's the kind of place where sound doesn't carry right, where the bogs breathe steam even when the air's cold and still. I used to think that that kind of talk was trail superstition, just stories meant to keep through hikers cautious on the Pacific Crest Trail. Well, that was before last July. So I'd been heading southbound after flipping at the Sierra, pushing long days to make up some time. It was late afternoon, the sky a heavy gold through the haze, when I realized that I hadn't seen another hiker in almost 2 days now. The section before White Pass is swampy too, ankle-deep water, slick roots, the kind of terrain that steals your speed and your confidence. I must have been about an hour from where I'd planned to camp when I saw him. He stepped out of the side of the trail like he'd been waiting for me. Tall, wiry, wearing short khaki shorts and a faded windbreaker zipped up to his throat. His hair was white, puffed like frost, and his backpack looked ancient, a boxy canvas sort of thing with metal buckles that clattered when he moved. "Southbounder?" he asked immediately, breathless, like the words had been sitting on his tongue too long. Yeah, I said, adjusting my pack. Then he asked, "You by yourself out here?" Something about the way that he said that made my stomach drop, like he already knew the answer and was just confirming it. I lied, of course, said I was hiking with a group, but they were just behind me. He smiled, quick and twitchy, and started walking with me anyway. His strides were short and eager, and every time I slowed down, he matched me, keeping exactly a pace behind my shoulder. The trail narrowed, cutting between black pines and thick reeds. The air suddenly smelled of rot and wet earth, and somewhere far off a raven croaked, and then even that sound vanished. He started talking again, not about hiking and not about the weather or anything, but about the bogs, about how deep they were. "You know," he said, voice suddenly brighter, "you could sink out here and nobody would ever find you. Whole hikers just gone, swallowed up." I tried to laugh it off, but he kept going. Said that he'd helped look for one once, a missing woman in 2018. Said that they found her pack floating, but never her body. He chuckled when he said it too. Then quieter, "Sometimes I think the ground gives them back, lady, you know." The metal things in his bags rattled when he shifted, heavy, uneven clinks, almost like tools perhaps. Well, I sped up, and so did he. I could feel his breath on my neck at one point, the heat of it in the humid air. My heart was pounding so hard now, too, that I could barely hear him, but I did catch one more thing before my legs kicked into full sprint. This is the stretch where they all go quiet. I don't remember deciding to run, but I did. The trail blurred, mud and roots and shadows. He tried to keep up. I could hear him, his steps fast and ragged, but then the sound faded. When I finally dared to look back, he was gone. Or at least I thought that he was. I rounded a bend near a small pond, and my hiking partner, the only person that I'd seen in days, was crouched by the water filling his bottle. I must have looked absolutely feral too, because his face went white as I waved at him, frantically mouthing that somebody is following me. He stood up just as the man came around the corner behind me, and for the first time I saw his face in full light. His pupils, too, were so small that they genuinely looked like pins. His expression fixed in something that wasn't quite surprise, but more like calculation, maybe. Well, when he saw my partner, he froze. Then, without a word, he turned and bolted down the trail, arms pumping, the clatter of metal echoing between the trees. He didn't slow, didn't glance back, just vanished. We chased after him for a while too, but the trail split and twisted, and when we reached the next clearing, the footprints ended. They just stopped. No mud disturbed, no reeds bent, nothing. We waited too, thinking that maybe he'd come back out from another side path or something, but he never did. I reported the encounter to a ranger at White Pass the next morning. They took notes and said that they'd pass it on, but their faces were unreadable, I guess. When I described the man, the old pack, the rattling, the white hair, one ranger, though, glanced at another, and the silence stretched until I finally asked if they had heard of him. The old ranger hesitated before saying, "Yeah, we've had a few reports, same description, always around the wetlands too." "Did you ever find him?" I asked. They just shook their head. Later that night, as I sat outside a store with my stove going, a local came over and asked if I had made it through the bogs all night. I told him about what happened, and he laughed quietly, not like it was funny, but more like it was familiar. "Yeah," he said, "my uncle used to talk about that guy sometimes. Been seen up there for decades now. Always looks the same too, always alone." He finished his coffee, looked at the tree line, and added, "Thing is that nobody's sure if he ever was a person to begin with." Sometimes I think back to that sound, the jangling inside of his pack, steady and metallic. I've convinced myself that it was tools, or maybe cooking gear, or something ordinary. But sometimes when I'm out hiking and the trail gets a bit quiet, I think back to that same dull clatter behind me just for a second, and I always wonder, what exactly was in that pack. And every single time after thinking about it, I find myself picking up the pace. The storm had passed hours ago, leaving the air thick and damp. I remember lying in bed, half awake, listening to the hum of my fan, that steady white noise that makes my little apartment feel less empty. It was just before dawn when I noticed that it had gone silent. No fan, no AC, no hum of the electricity at all. I opened my eyes into a darkness that felt heavier than usual, like it had weight to it. There was a knock then. Not a normal knock. This one rattled the entire doorframe, a deep, metallic pounding that shook the wall above my headboard. It came again, louder, and I remember thinking for a split second that I was dreaming. I had been taking Benadryl to sleep, and sometimes my dreams feel too real. But then I heard it a third time. The sharp edge of somebody's hand slamming against the wood, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, measured, crossing the hallway. Now, I live alone on the second floor of a small, century-old apartment building wedged between a thrift store and an abandoned bank. There are only 3 units upstairs. I know the neighbors, or at least I thought I did. I stayed perfectly still. The air felt suddenly strange, cold, but with this faint smell of like ozone, like before lightning strikes. And in the distance, I heard somebody whisper, 2 voices, low and hurried. A man saying, no, we were just walking. Then silence. When the silence stretched too long, I reached for my phone. No signal, no service. Just the dead screen glow. I thought of my downstairs neighbor, the one with the 2 pit bulls. She'd once mentioned to me that they never bark unless something was really wrong. My hand shook as I typed out a message. Hey, are you awake? I think someone's trying to get in upstairs. I didn't expect her to see it right away, but within seconds, she was calling me. Her voice came through in a whisper. Don't move. I saw them. They tried my door first. Her dogs had gone quiet, she said, tails down and pacing. She had already called the police, thankfully. When I finally dared to leave the bedroom, I noticed something strange. The door to the breaker box at the end of the hall had been torn completely off of its hinges. Every switch was flipped down, and that's why the building had gone dead. My neighbor met me halfway down the stairs barefoot, one hand gripping her phone, the other on a leash. She said that she had seen 2 men slip out of the side entrance, both wearing dark clothes, faces half covered, one carrying something heavy in his arms. Well, we checked the lobby light, and it was still off. She managed to reset the breakers, and one by one the fluorescent bulbs flickered back to life. For a moment, everything looked almost normal again too, but the light just didn't feel right. It had a faint pulse to it, like it was breathing. The 3rd tenant, the quiet woman across the hall from me, finally stepped out, rubbing her eyes, asking what was going on. She looked dazed, like she had been dreaming something that she couldn't shake. When we told her what had happened, she went pale and said that she hadn't heard a thing, except right before she woke, she thought that she heard someone whisper her name through the vent. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, they walked the perimeter, took our statements, and checked the power room. One officer mentioned that it looked like the breakers hadn't just been flipped, but that they had been pulled and tampered with, like someone yanked the entire panel open with force. They promised to review the footage from the security camera outside, but the landlord called later that night and said something really odd. The feed? Apparently it had gone dark just before the power outage, and when it came back on, the camera showed only static and then the empty street. No sign of the men, no footprints in the damp dust of the stairwell or anything. And, to me at least, this whole situation seemed like it was performed by professionals. I've always thought of myself as cautious but not paranoid. My mum always says that I have city instincts, though I've never really lived anywhere bigger than a mid-sized suburb. Still though, I lock my doors the moment that I get in my car, I check the back seat before driving off, and I park under lights when I can. And I mean, you do these things enough and they start to feel just like common sense. Anyway, it was a Thursday evening, the kind that feels unnervingly quiet. The grocery store lot was mostly empty when I pulled in, just the hum of the big streetlight overhead and the buzz of a vending machine outside the doors. A white sedan sat across the aisle from me, its engines off, windows half down, and I could see the faint glow of a phone lighting up the driver's face. I didn't think too much of it. I parked a few rows away, scrolling through my notes app to double-check my shopping list. I'd been sitting for maybe 3 minutes when something thudded against my window. Not a tap, but a heavy, jarring knock that made my heart stop for a bit. I turned, expecting maybe a store employee or someone asking for directions. Instead, there was a woman, probably in her 60s, wearing a faded blue dress, her hair tucked under a scarf. She was standing uncomfortably close, one hand pressed to the glass. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her face was pale and her gaze steady, like she was trying to see through the reflection. Then she lifted her other hand. That was when I noticed what she was holding. It wasn't a piece of paper like I'd first thought. Instead, it was a knife. Not huge, but definitely a kitchen knife, the kind with a wooden handle. She had pointed it down by her side, almost casually. My brain tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe she was holding something else. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But then she leaned closer, her breath fogging the window. I could now see the small nicks along the blade as the light from the lamppost caught it. I did not roll the window down. In fact, I barely breathed. She knocked again, harder this time, the smile disappearing from her face. She mouthed something through the glass, 3 words, I think, but her lips moved too quickly to read. My gut screamed at me to leave. I started the engine. Her expression changed instantly, like a mask cracking, and she stepped back, just enough for me to pull out. As I reversed, I saw her pivot on her heel and walk quietly toward the white sedan. The driver inside turned his head toward me, and both of them just sort of sat there, watching as I drove out of the lot. I took the long way to another store 20 minutes away that day, and even then I parked near the entrance and sat there, gripping my wheel for a bit. My phone buzzed, a text from my mum asking if I wanted to come by for dinner. I almost said yes, just to be near somebody else, but before I replied, I saw something in my side mirror. A white sedan easing into the lot. I couldn't be sure that it was the same one, given how far away it was, but I didn't wait to find out. I drove out of there, drove home, locked the doors, and I sat in the dark with the curtains closed until morning. But when I told my mother about what happened, she laughed at first and said that I'd just let my imagination run wild, that maybe the woman was just confused, carrying something harmless, but I know what I saw. A few days later, I went back to that store in daylight this time, thinking that maybe it would feel less strange, but there were police cars there parked near the entrance, and 2 officers were talking to an employee by the carts. They were pointing at a security camera. One of them was holding something in a plastic evidence bag. It was a knife, and while I cannot be sure that it was her knife, I can say for a fact that it definitely looked the same. Our old neighborhood sat on the edge of a stretch of woods that everyone just called the Belt. It wasn't really a forest, but more like a tangle of overgrown lots that never really got developed because the ground was way too soft. Back then, I was 10 and my brother was 7. It was New Year's Eve, 2018, and we'd gone down to a friend's house to watch some fireworks from her backyard. It wasn't far by any means, 5, maybe 6 minutes from home. My mum said that we could walk back before midnight as long as we stuck together. The air had that brittle winter stillness to it, no sound but the echoes of fireworks in the distance. We cut across the street toward our home, the yellow porch light shining at the end of the block. I remember my brother talking about how the fireworks looked like flowers. And then, halfway down the street, he just stopped walking. "Who's at our place?" he asked. I followed his gaze. 2 men were standing near our front wall, half in the shadow and half in the spill of our porch light. They weren't talking, but just standing there, facing the house. One of them had his hands in his pockets. The other had something, maybe a bag or a jacket, slung over his shoulder. "Probably just people from next door," I said, trying to sound casual. Our neighbor was known for throwing parties, so it wasn't a weird assumption by any means. But when we got closer, both men turned their heads at the same time. Not fast, but slowly, like they'd been expecting us. They started walking toward us. At first, it looked like they were just crossing the street, but as they got closer, I heard it. The sound of them making low, guttural noises. Not words, but it sounded like dogs growling through their teeth. Upon hearing that, I whispered, "Run." We bolted back up the street, cutting around the corner into a narrow passage that led behind the row of houses. My brother was crying and I was terrified. I ducked behind a brick wall near the end house, trying to stay quiet. I had an old flip phone that my mum made me carry in case of emergencies, but my hands were shaking so bad that it took me 3 tries to unlock it. When she answered, she sounded sort of half asleep, and I told her that somebody was outside of the house. She thought that I was joking. I heard her footsteps through the phone, and she went to the door, still scolding me, and then silence. For a long, horrible moment, there was nothing. Then she shouted, her voice so sharp that it made my brother jump, "Why are you on my property?" Through the receiver, I heard muffled apologies, a man's voice stammering something about being lost, another voice laughing nervously, and then my mum again, angry this time, "And why are you following my kids?" There was what sounded like a scuffle of movement, more apologies, and then the line went dead. By the time that she called back, the men were gone. She said that they had taken off down the opposite street. The police came later, but there wasn't much to report. No break-in, no damage, just 2 strangers who might have been drunk. We never found out who they were, but a few weeks later, I was out behind the houses again with a friend. The path sort of looped around a set of garages that backed onto the woods there. We were playing there when a black van with tinted windows rolled slowly down into the lane. It didn't stop, and it just crept along the edge, engine barely idling. We stepped aside, assuming that they were looking for an address, but the van circled back. Once, twice, then a 3rd time. The last time it passed, the window rolled down halfway and I couldn't see the driver's face, just a pair of eyes behind glasses, watching us as the van moved past. There was something taped to the inside of the windshield, though, a scrap of red paper or sort of cloth or something fluttering in the air. Well, we ran until our legs hurt, and when I told my mum, she said that it was probably nothing, but after that, she started locking the front gate again, and she kept the porch light on all night too. We moved out maybe a year after that, and my brother still refuses to walk alone in the dark after this. A few months ago, while helping my mother unpack at her new place, I found one of our old moving boxes with garage stuff scrolled on the side. and inside, beneath some dusty extension cords, was a scrap of red fabric, torn and folded once. And it looked a lot like what was inside of that van the day that I saw those guys idle by us. I didn't tell her about it, but seeing it certainly shocked me. I was 13 the summer that my parents started working late. We lived on the edge of a small, quiet town where everyone supposedly knew everyone, and my afternoons were often spent alone until well past dinner. I didn't mind at first. I'd make myself a sandwich, do my homework, maybe watch a bit of TV before they got home, and it just became routine. It was ordinary and safe. Now, it started one Thursday in late November. I just walked home from school and noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street, a grey sedan with windows half rolled down. There wasn't anything too odd about it, except that it seemed to idle there for a long time. I went inside, minding my own business, locked the door, and tried to ignore it. A few minutes later, though, the doorbell rang, a sharp, quick sound that made my stomach flip. When I peeked through the peephole, I saw a woman. She was older, maybe late 40s, with a tidy haircut and a long green coat. She smiled when she spotted movement behind the glass. "Your parents asked me to pick you up," she said cheerfully. "There's been a small accident at your mum's work. Nothing serious, but she just asked me to come and take you to her." Her voice was calm, confident. Too confident. I had also never seen her before. I told her that I couldn't open the door, and she frowned slightly, then softened again. "Sweetheart, it's all right. You can even call her if you want. I'll wait in the car, okay?" Problem is that I didn't have a phone back then. My parents had taken the house phone with them that morning. We only used mobile. And plus, I didn't know my mother's work number by heart as well, so my mind raced for something sensible to say, but before I could respond, she added quietly, "You don't want to make her wait, do you? It's important." Something about that line, the way that she said important, it made my skin crawl. Still, when she smiled again, I opened the door halfway, and that was a huge mistake. She immediately reached out, gently but firmly taking hold of my wrist. "Come on, love, we don't have all day." I remember being pulled outside, still trying to process what was going on. The car door opened and a man that I hadn't noticed before, tall with a wide, uneasy grin, waved me in. He didn't say anything until we started driving. "Your mum's fine," he said after a while, eyes fixed on the road. "We'll stay at our place until she calls. There's food and you can rest there." I sat silently in the seat, watching the houses fade away as we drove into the hills. The towns disappeared behind us, then the trees, and then the light. Their house wasn't far, but it felt like we'd crossed into a different world at this stage. It was a narrow, two-story building with faded green curtains covering every window. The air, it smelled faintly of mildew and old candles. The woman, who now asked me to call her Miss Ellen, led me upstairs to a small bedroom. It had floral wallpaper and a single bed already made. "You'll sleep here," she said. "We'll get you home soon." I asked for a phone to call my parents. She hesitated, then smiled again. "The line's been down all week, dear. Don't worry." She closed the door behind her. I sat there, staring at the wallpaper until it started to blur a bit. There were faint pencil marks on the wall too, I noticed. Little lines like someone had been counting days or something. I must have been there for days too, maybe even weeks. It's hard to tell, but they fed me, talked to me like I was their own. The man, Uncle Henry, as she called him, he was quieter, but sometimes I'd catch him staring when he thought that I wasn't looking. At night, I'd hear them whispering outside of my door, their voices low and urgent. I could never make out the words, but One night, I woke up to find Miss Ellen sitting on the end of my bed. Her face was shadowed and her hair was untidy. "You shouldn't ask to leave," she whispered. "If you leave, they'll forget you. People forget so easily." I didn't understand what she was saying. I only nodded. She smiled like that was the right answer, and she left the room. After that, things start to blur a bit, but I remember feeding their dog, walking into the garden, even laughing once when it chased a butterfly. Everything just sort of felt like a dream, detached as if time had lost its meaning. When the police came one night, I was half asleep. The sound of the door breaking open jolted me upright. Miss Ellen screamed from somewhere downstairs, and I heard men shouting my name. The next thing I knew, I was being pulled out into the sunlight. I had thought that it was nighttime, but apparently it wasn't. My parents were there crying and shouting questions that I couldn't answer. The officer said that apparently I'd been gone for nearly 2 weeks at this stage. 2 weeks, just a few kilometers from home. For a long time afterward, too, I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined parts of it, that they'd just been confused, maybe trying to help me. But that obviously doesn't explain why they locked the doors at night, or why, when I was finally old enough to look up their names, there were no records of anyone by those names ever living in that house. The strangest part, the house with the green curtains, it's still there. Empty, silent, the garden overgrown. But sometimes when I go by it, I often think back about that time and, well, it's hard to remember everything. Now that I'm a bit older, I can see that I was kidnapped by these people. I still am not sure as to what their motivations were, but the fact that they took me, it's eerie walking past this house still. I used to think that I was good at being alone. I travel a lot for work, spend most nights in hotels, and silence doesn't really bother me. But there was something about that house. The stillness, the way sound seemed to sort of stretch through its narrow halls. It made me realize that some silence has weight to it almost. It was the summer of 2023, and I'd agreed to stay at a friend of a friend's place while they were overseas. They lived about 40 minutes north of Albany, tucked away on a patch of land that backed into heavy woods. The house looked ordinary enough from the outside: white paint, black shutters, overgrown rose bushes climbing the porch rail. Inside, though, it felt strangely crowded, as if every inch had been built to hold something more than people. They told me that I'd have the place to myself for about 8 days. There was a cat to feed, mail to bring in, and a few plants to water. Easy enough. I figured that it'd be a quiet retreat from the city for a few days, a chance to breathe a bit, maybe finish the book that I'd been writing. Now, for the first 3 nights, it was exactly that too. Peaceful. I'd wake up to birds, make coffee, work at the dining room table, and fall asleep early to catch up on some sleep. But around the 4th night, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious, but just little things. Like, I'd find the living room light on when I was sure that I'd turned it off. The bathroom door would be half open, but I had definitely shut it tight. One morning, the back door latch was unhooked. Not wide open, but definitely hanging loose. I told myself that I'd probably forgotten it. I mean, you do weird things when you're tired and you're at a new place. Then there was a noise. It started as a light tapping from upstairs while I was watching TV one day. Rhythmic, uneven, almost like someone pacing but trying not to be heard. The kind of sound that makes your brain freeze for a second before you convince yourself that it's nothing. The cat, they were curled up beside me, fast asleep, which didn't help. I muted the TV for a moment and just listened, and the sound stopped immediately. that became a bit of a pattern too. Every time I focused on it, there was silence. By the sixth night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept waking up around the same time, 3:17 a.m., to the creak of a floorboard overhead. That top floor too, it made me feel uneasy. The staircase up there was narrow and steep, and the landing had a long hallway lined with 4 closed doors. Only one of them, the guest bedroom, was supposed to be in use, but I hadn't opened the other doors, and that night I did. I got up and grabbed my phone for light and started up the stairs. The hallway was colder than the rest of the house, I noticed, noticeably so too, and I walked past the guest room, peered into the empty office, then the storage room, but there was nothing. No footprints, no draft, nothing. When I reached the last door, I noticed the doorknob was slightly turned though, like it hadn't fully latched, and I pushed it open expecting to see boxes or furniture, but there was nothing. Just a small square room with bare walls and a single chair in the middle. I stood there for a long time, and the silence wasn't quiet anymore. It was full. I know that sounds odd, but it was like someone was holding their breath beside me. Then, from somewhere close behind, I heard the faintest whisper, and I swear to you that it said, "Stop looking." Upon hearing that, I swung around. I backed out, shut the door, and I left every light in the hallway on until morning. When the couple came home a few days later, I didn't plan on saying anything. I mean, it felt ridiculous. I didn't want to sound like one of those people who hears things in old houses, but as we were chatting in the kitchen, the husband sort of mentioned casually, "Hope the nights weren't too noisy. That place can get weird after dark." The way that he said weird made my stomach turn too, and his wife sort of looked uneasily at me. "Did you stay upstairs?" she asked. I nodded, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, in the guest room. Why?" She exchanged a glance with her husband before saying quietly, "We usually keep that whole floor closed off now." When I asked why, she hesitated. "Well, we used to rent the house before buying it, and the previous owners left in a bit of a hurry. Apparently their kid was sleepwalking and talking to someone who wasn't there, always in that back room." She didn't elaborate any further, and I didn't push. I left that day without taking the money that they'd offered for house sitting, and I just wanted out. Anyway, a few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me, I suppose, and I looked the property up online, thinking that maybe I'd find a mention of its history or something. There wasn't really much, just a blurry photo of an old real estate listing, and in that photo, taken years before the couple owned it, I could see something that was weird. In the upstairs window, the one at the end of the hall belonging to the bare little room, there was what looked like an outline of a figure standing there perfectly still. And the chair that I had seen in the center of the room, well, it wasn't there in the old photo, but beside the window you could just make out faint words carved out into the wooden frame. The listing image was too low quality to read them clearly, but it looked like 3 words. I don't know what they said, but it's weird, right? I mean, I'm not one to jump to ghost as the conclusion for things like this, but I know what I heard and I won't forget it. My parents used to tell this story late at night, usually after a few drinks, when the house was quiet and the lights were low. It wasn't one of those exaggerated family tales that grow stranger over time or anything. This one never changed. Every version ended the same way too, with my mother saying that she'd never set foot near that street again, and my father staring off like he could still see something the rest of us couldn't. It all started in 1994, when they first moved into a rental on Brenton Hollow Road, a squat little house surrounded by scrub pines and half an acre of uneven land. My dad, he had just started a new job at the steel plant, and my mum was finishing her nursing degree too. They weren't looking for dream home material, in other words, just something cheap and quiet until they could save. That house, it fit the bill. 2 bedrooms and a small den, a porch that sagged a little bit, and a detached shed that leaned so far that it looked ready to give up. The landlord, a tired man named Kessler, told them that the last tenants had left in a hurry, but never said why. My dad laughed it off. I mean, rent was rent. For the first few weeks, too, everything was good. My mum said that the only thing that felt odd was just how quiet the place was. No birds, no neighbors, just the crickets at night. Then, one afternoon, an old neighbor from across the road stopped by. He brought a pie and a strange gift, a ceramic doll, no taller than a milk jug, painted in flaking red and gold. Its face was fixed in a permanent grin. She used to sit in the window, the man said, figured that she belonged to the house. My mum, she didn't want it, but she was way too polite to say so, so she set it on a shelf above the dining table and just left it there. That night, while they were eating dinner, the doll started to hum. It wasn't loud, just a thin metallic whine, like the whining of a music box buried deep inside of it. My dad opened the back to look for a key or maybe a crank, but found nothing. It was solid porcelain. They figured that maybe it was just settling or some weird trick of the air in an old house. But over the next few nights, the humming got louder. Sometimes it happened when the room was empty. Sometimes my mum swore that she could hear it faintly before she even walked through the front door. By the second week, it stopped humming altogether, but things started moving. Not anything too dramatic, but like a chair an inch off from where it had been. And then came the scratching. It started behind the wall in their bedroom, right where the bed frame touched the plaster. My dad assumed mice, so he bought some traps, but he could never catch anything. In fact, he tore out a small panel behind the dresser and found nothing but clean dust. That night, the sound started again too, except this time it came from inside of their closet. When he opened it too, he said that the air was like ice cold, like opening a fridge. And that was the first night that my mother refused to sleep there. A week later, my dad found muddy boot prints in the hallway, large ones, too large to belong to either of them. They started from the back door, trailed through the kitchen, and stopped at the foot of their bed. That's when my dad bought a lock for every door, but it didn't seem to help. One evening, my mum was unloading groceries when she saw someone standing beside the shed, tall, thin, wearing a brimmed hat that shadowed his face. She thought that it was a neighbor, until he lifted his arm in a sort of stiff, unnatural motion and pointed at the house. She screamed for my dad, and when he came running, the man had disappeared. Also, the dirt where he had been standing was, well, seemingly untouched, as if no one had been there to begin with. Again, they tried to ignore it. People see weird things at dusk, right? But my mum couldn't shake the feeling that something was inside with them. She said that she'd wake up to the faint scent of, like, dampness or hear footsteps pacing in the hall, slow and deliberate, pausing right outside of their door every night. But the final straw, that came weeks later. My dad had picked up a night shift at the plant, leaving my mum alone at nights. It was around midnight, and she was folding laundry when the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out. She grabbed a flashlight, walked to the fuse box by the kitchen, and instantly stopped in her tracks, because every door in the house was now open. Not wide open, but just slightly ajar, perfectly even, like someone had walked through each room and stopped to check behind them. Then she noticed something worse. That old ceramic doll was no longer on the shelf. It was sitting on the floor near the back door, facing her. She bolted outside and called my dad from the neighbor's phone. He came home immediately and searched every inch of the house, and found nothing in the end. But when he picked up the doll, he realized something new had been carved into its porcelain chest. There were a set of initials that neither of them originally recognized, etched deep like someone had taken a knife to it. Well, 2 days later, they packed up and they just left without warning. My dad, he lost his deposit, which he was pretty angry about, but to be honest, he didn't seem to care too much. Years later, when I was a teenager, my mum told me that she once drove past that place again. The house was gone now. Apparently it had burned down and it was just an empty lot. But she said that she pulled over anyway, just for a moment. Across the clearing, half hidden in the grass, was a sort of rusted metal sign. Somebody had spray painted something on it, but she never went to check, and she didn't get out of the car and just drove home and never really mentioned it again. I have asked her a few times what she thought that it all meant, but she always says the same thing every time. She says that it wasn't that the house was haunted. She believes that it was the land instead, and that some things just don't let go because you move away. It's strange how easily we get used to unfamiliar places, right? Well, when I moved into this dorm last semester, it felt like stepping into a halfway world. Rows of identical rooms, all smelling faintly of detergent and dust, each filled with people pretending that they were fine. By the second month, I barely noticed the creaks in the ceiling or the way the fluorescent lights hummed just a little too loud. But last week, something happened to me that made me wish that I had never come here at all. So our room sleeps four. I'm on the third bed, across from the window. My bunk faces the fourth bed, and it's the one that's always neatly made, with a small stuffed bear on the pillow. It belonged to a girl named Alina before she transferred out mid-semester. We never got a roommate after she left, but a few nights ago, I woke up for no reason that I can really explain, but my phone said 3:27 a.m. The light from the hallway slipped through the crack under the door, and it was just enough to make out shapes in the dark. I was sort of looking around the room, just sort of in a bit of a half daze, and that's when I saw someone sitting on Alina's bed. Her back was to me, shoulders rising and falling slowly, but it was like she was breathing, or maybe heaving, I guess. Her hair was loose, long and dark, and she was running her fingers through it, as if trying to untangle it maybe. The faintest rustling sound filled the silence, and I could almost hear her nails catching around the strands. Half asleep, I told myself that it had to be one of my roommates. Maybe it was Rhea, getting up early for her nursing shift. I blinked a few times to clear my eyes, but the figure didn't fade. She was still there, sitting completely still now, head slightly tilted, as though she knew that somebody was watching. When I turned to check Rhea's bed, she was there, fast asleep. So was Lena, both of them breathing slowly and steady, their blankets rising and falling in the dim light. I turned back, and the girl on Alina's bed was standing now, her hair covering most of her face and her head hanging unnaturally low, as if her neck had forgotten how to hold it upright. She began moving toward the door, slow at first, then sort of gliding, almost soundless, until she stopped just before the latch. I didn't move. My chest felt tight, and it was like watching through somebody else's eyes, and she lifted her hand and pressed her palm flat against the door. Then, without turning, she whispered something. I couldn't make out the words, though. The next thing that I remember, too, is that it was morning time. My alarm went off at 7, and sunlight spilled across the floor like nothing had happened. my roommates were arguing about who finished the milk or something, and for a few moments I convinced myself that I must have had a dream or a bad nightmare or something. But when I looked toward the door, there was a faint smeared handprint low on the wood, like somebody had touched it with wet fingers or oily hands. That afternoon, while waiting for laundry, I ran into one of the seniors who lived in our room the year before. I don't even remember how the topic came up, but when I mentioned waking at night and seeing someone sitting on the empty bed, her face instantly went pale. "Was she brushing her hair?" she asked. I nodded. She didn't say much else, just that the last girl who stayed in that bed before Alina moved, without explanation I might add, left their things behind, and when they cleared her drawers, they found a single clump of hair tied neatly with a ribbon tucked into one of the pillowcases. Well, that night I slept with the lights on, and every night since then too. I keep telling myself that there has to be a reasonable explanation, that I was dreaming or having a bad nightmare or something, but every morning lately, without fail, that mark is there on the door again. One palm print, slightly sort of blurred, like it was pressed there by someone standing on the inside, trying to get out. So I used to work seasonal gigs during the fall, mostly helping set up haunted attractions around small towns. It wasn't glamorous by any means, minimum wage, long hours, lots of fake blood and screaming teenagers, but it paid for my rent. In 2022, I got hired at a traveling scare park that set up just outside of Middletown. They called it the Hollow Grounds, a stitched-together maze of hayrides, fog machines, and actors in cheap masks. My job was to run the lights near the Carnival of Shadows set, basically a large striped tent filled with clowns and strobe effects. Now, when guests weren't coming through, I'd take breaks behind the tent where we stored props and spare bulbs and all that. The area backed onto a stretch of overgrown woods that ran along an old golf course back there. There was a narrow dirt lane between us and the trees, mostly used by staff on the carts to haul equipment. Most nights were pretty loud, chaotic, and really busy, but on October 21st, everything felt quieter than usual. The air was colder than it should have been for Delaware that time of year, and the fog that night didn't seem to roll in at all. It just sort of appeared, thick and low to the ground. Around 10:45, we had 15-minute lulls between rides, so I slipped out back to have a smoke. The moon was full, bright enough to paint the clearing silver. I sat down on a crate, scrolled my phone for a bit, and tried to warm my hands up. A few minutes passed before I noticed movement on the dirt lane beyond the tent. Somebody was walking out there. At first, I thought that it was one of the actors cutting across the field, maybe heading to the storage shed. But then I realized just how tall they were. Their back rose well above the fence line, 8 foot at least, and they moved sort of wrong. That's when I realized that the motion wasn't human. The limbs were bent strangely, way too long, almost jointed like an animal's, but they didn't hit the ground right. Then I realized that it was walking on 4 legs that looked both rigid and liquid sort of at the same time, like it was struggling to hold its shape. For a few seconds, I told myself that I was just seeing things. I'd been running on caffeine and cold pizza all night, but as it passed through the moonlight, I could see it clearly. A figure, white as bone, matte and featureless, its surface absorbing light instead of reflecting it. No face, no details, no texture, just a pale shifting outline moving slowly down the path. The sound that it made wasn't like footsteps too. It was more like static maybe, faint and uneven as if something was vibrating behind the air. Every time that it turned its head towards me, if that was its head, I felt my stomach twist with a kind of panic that I don't think I've ever experienced before. It stopped halfway down the lane, and then the thing's body sort of rippled, like a mirage bending heat, and I swear that I saw it lean slightly toward me too, as if trying to recognize what I was. Then it kept walking, unhurried, until it just sort of disappeared into the woods. I must have sat there for a full minute at least after it vanished before I could move again. When I finally stood, my hands were shaking and I dropped my cigarette. I bolted to the front of the tent where two of the other actors were chatting and told them what I had seen. They laughed at first until one of them, an older guy who worked that site for years, stopped smiling. He then said to me, "You saw it on the trail, didn't you?" When I nodded, his face went tight. He told me that a few of the crew who had worked that zone in past seasons, that they had seen something similar, a white figure that moved like smoke, trapped in what seemed like a shape. One girl quit mid-shift after she saw it watching her from the woods apparently. Management brushed it off and said that it was probably a prank or a trick of the light or whatever, but the older guy swore that that part of the property used to be a stretch of marshland where allegedly a small plane crashed decades ago. The wreck was never cleared properly, and he said that the pilot's remains weren't found for weeks. I didn't believe that at first, but a few nights later I looked up some old records of that place, and there really had been a crash there in 1978, a small plane that went down during the fog. Both passengers were declared missing and they were presumed dead. The recovery report mentioned the search had been hampered by unstable ground and poor visibility. Well, after that night, I refused to go out behind the tent alone any longer. Even in the daylight, that patch of trees just felt wrong now, way too quiet and too still. The following weekend was my last shift of the season, and I told my boss that I was done after Halloween, and I never went back. When we first moved into this townhouse, I told myself that I'd finally stop jumping at shadows. It was quiet, new, clean, no creaking floorboards, no drafty windows, no strange sounds, just the sort of place that you dream of raising a family up in. We'd been here nearly a year too when I found the old baby monitor again, tucked inside of a box of toys that we'd never unpacked. It was one of those sort of night vision camera ones, and it had a small handheld screen. I remember buying it when our daughter was still an infant, though I couldn't remember why we stopped using it. It felt comforting to set it up again too, a way to keep an extra eye on her now that she had started sleeping in her own toddler bed across the room from ours. She was only 2, and I still woke up sometimes expecting to hear her crying. That first night, everything was good too. She fell asleep easily, clutching her stuffed rabbit. My husband and I stayed up late watching some TV, and I kept the monitor beside me on the couch, half sort of watching the green-tinted image of her tiny form. At some point, I noticed what looked like movement too, a faint shimmer beside her bed, like something brushing past. I blinked, but when I did, it was gone. I assumed it was just interference, like static, or maybe the wireless router or whatever. But then it started happening more often. Every night, sometime after 2 in the morning, the image would sort of flicker, and I'd see shapes. Sometimes it even looked like a hand reached toward her blanket. Sometimes a vague silhouette was sort of leaning over her, as though checking if she was awake. I would hold my breath and whisper for my husband to look, but whenever he went into her room, there was never anything there. He joked that I was seeing ghosts in pixels, but even he stopped laughing after I showed him a recording. The monitor had a bit of a replay feature, and one morning I scrolled back through the night, and for a brief moment at around 3:12 in the morning, the figure was pretty visible, tall, motionless, standing at the end of her bed. Its head looked bowed, its arms long and narrow. Then the screen cut to static for a full 10 seconds before the image came back, clear as day, with no one there. As you can imagine, I was struggling to sleep at this stage. I moved the camera thinking that maybe it was just the angle, or Maybe a reflection from our TV or headlights from outside or something. But even when I shifted it to the far corner, the same thing happened. Figures near her bed, faint gliding movement across the room, a strange soft distortion like breath fogging glass all over the camera. I told myself to just stop obsessing over it. But then something else started. The audio. At first, it was just faint static. But then, I swear to you that we could hear whispers. Not words exactly, but more like the rhythm of someone speaking under their breath, close to the microphone. I would mute it, then unmute it again, hoping to catch a bit of a pattern or thinking that maybe the device was malfunctioning, but once, right before dawn, I thought that I heard my daughter's voice. Not crying, but just talking softly like she does when she's playing alone. Except her lips weren't moving. The next morning, when I asked her what she had been talking to in her dreams, she smiled and said, "The lady in the window." Mind you, there's no window on that wall. After that, I started unplugging the monitor during the day, but even then it would sometimes turn itself on. I'd come into the room and I would see the green LED blinking light and the screen showing faint motion, though the plug was still out of the wall. One night, I finally called the property manager, asking if anything odd had happened with the previous tenants. He hesitated before saying that the family before us had moved out early for personal reasons. When I pressed him, he said that they had a daughter about the same age, a lovely child, and then he went quiet and just changed the subject. The next day, I knocked on our neighbor's door, an older woman who had lived there for over a decade at this stage. When I mentioned our address, her face fell, and she said softly, "That unit's always been strange. There used to be a man there years ago before they built the new development. He'd lost his wife and child in a car accident, apparently. Wouldn't leave the house. People said that he used to stand by his daughter's crib for hours, whispering to her like she was still there." I didn't know what to say. But that night, I left the monitor off, stuffed it in the closet, and told myself that it was over. But at around 3 a.m, my daughter started crying. Not the soft, sleepy cry that she usually had, but a panicked sort of cry, almost a scream. When I ran in, she was standing in the corner, pointing toward the closet where the monitor sat, and she kept repeating, "He's in there." The next morning, the monitor screen cracked straight down the middle too, though nobody had touched it, and so I threw it away. We haven't used that baby monitor since, but my daughter still sometimes wakes up laughing softly, looking at the same empty corner of the room, and when I ask her what's so funny, she just whispers, "He likes when you're watching." We will be moving next month, and I told my husband that I just want a fresh start, somewhere bright and open and, well, just normal. I never liked the house on the ridge, even before we moved in. Something about it just made my stomach twist, and I don't know, maybe it was the way that it sat at the edge of a dry gully, or how the wind made the tin roof literally groan like an old animal trying to breathe. But my parents, they were thrilled. It was cheap, modern enough, and came with enough land for my brothers to tear around on their dirt bikes on. I was 11 and we had just moved from the city to start over. The nights were filled with the usual country sounds there, crickets, the distant call of frogs, but a few weeks after settling in, I started waking up to something else. It wasn't a creak or a knock, not even an animal cry. It was a scream. Not far away and not muffled, but like right next to me. It was so close that it made my ear ache at one point, and a woman's voice was breaking through into raw, tearing sort of agony. It was the kind of sound that you cannot confuse for anything else too. The kind that makes your body go completely rigid before your mind even catches up. I would sit up in bed, heart hammering, and look around the room. My brothers would always be snoring, the hall light spilling faintly under the door. There was nothing. And when I would ask if anyone else heard it, they would just stare blankly and they would all shake their heads. "It's probably just a fox," my mum said once, sort of half asleep. "They scream like that sometimes, you know." But I'd heard many animals before, and yeah, some of them can sound eerie, but this just wasn't that. This was human. The worst part, though, was just how it changed. At first, it came every few nights, a sharp cry like somebody startled. Then it became longer, closer, more sustained, as though this woman was drawing nearer. I eventually stopped sleeping properly as well, lying awake and just waiting for the sound. One night I tried recording it on my old MP3 player too. I left it running beside my bed, microphone facing out. The scream came right on cue, a long shaking wail that felt like it was inside of my head. And when I played it back in the morning, there was nothing there but silence. No crickets, no wind, no breath, just a hollow hiss where the sound should have been. I started to dread bedtime too. I begged my parents to let me sleep in the lounge, even on the floor, but they said that I was just being dramatic. "You've been watching too many horror movies," Dad said. I stopped mentioning it after that too. By the third week, it was happening nightly, sometimes even twice a night. And that was when I began to notice some other small things too. The smell of like burnt air just before it started, like when you turn on an old heater. Sometimes my lamp would flicker, even when it wasn't plugged in. Once I thought that I saw movement in the corner of my vision, a blur of pale fabric near the wardrobe. And then, weirdly, as suddenly as it began, it just stopped. No fading, no warning, just silence. And for the rest of that year, I slept without a sound. I almost convinced myself, too, that I must have imagined it. Well, we moved out a few months later when Dad got a new job down south. I was relieved to leave that place behind, but a few nights after settling into our new home, hundreds of kilometers away, mind you, I woke up to a faint noise at the edge of my bed. Not a scream this time, just breathing, slow and uneven, almost like someone trying not to cry. I kept my eyes shut, hoping that it would fade, and eventually it did. But sometimes, even now, more than a decade later, if I wake up suddenly in the dark, I know that something is about to begin. And sometimes I hear that breathing again against my ear. It's petrifying when it happens, and I hate it. I've tried to rationalize it too, telling myself that it must be stress or an overactive imagination. But a few years ago, curiosity got the better of me, and I tried to sort of interact with it. That night was absolutely terrifying. I went to bed like normal, and something crawled on top of me and onto my bed, and I could hear breathing, and again it was like that trying not to cry sound. I was so scared that I instantly jumped out of bed, and I ran down the hall, and I didn't go back into my room all night. I still don't know what it's all about or what this thing is, but I know it's not sleep paralysis because, well, I'm awake every time. Like I said, I literally jumped out of bed, so I just don't know how to explain it.